Hi, welcome to iRanza Insights, real talk about childhood emotional abuse. I am Jasmine Hollis, founder and president of iRanza Corporation, where we raise awareness of childhood emotional abuse and provide tools for healing. I am here today with Dr. Erica Shapiro, a counselor at Keystone School in San Antonio, Texas. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me to talk.
Of course.
So as first question, what do you do specifically, like day to day?
Well, that varies quite a bit, but on an average day, as the counselor here at the school, I focus a lot on social emotional development across grade levels. So for lower school or elementary school, that might look like focusing on age-appropriate conflict resolution, friendships and relationships, early work with like growth mindset and how to handle setbacks and coping strategies. With middle school, that might be, looking at the impact of social development. And so helping students navigate friendships and relationships, parental relationships, and communication with parental figures. A lot of times, since middle school and young adolescents are a lot of identity development and things like that. We talk a lot about those questions. As well as just kind of support with any sort of emotional concerns. High school, I do freshman wellness class, and we focus a lot on, again, kind of identity development, sleep hygiene, self-care, building resilience, adaptive coping strategies, things along those lines, nutrition as well. We focus quite a bit on that as well. And then I'm also a resource for faculty and staff. So if there are concerns or if staff and faculty need support, I'm here for them as well. And then obviously with students, coping with school stressors, family stressors, mental health concerns. I'm a conduit for children and families to not only find kind of school-based support, but also support out in the community with outpatient referrals and helping facilitate students finding mental health, therapy or support that is available out in the community.
Why choose to become a counselor?
So that's a really great question. I think for me, it was especially kind of moving back into the school setting, the private school setting. It was a setting that I was familiar with, and that I went to an independent school, pre-K through 12th grade as well. So I found that environment really shaped who I was as a child and a student and even a young adult. And so it was always a desire of mine to come back and give back to a school and to the student body and the community as a whole, as a way to, as I said, to give back to a school that felt very similar to my own. I also think it's an incredible privilege to support the next generation of thinkers and doers and help them navigate the inevitable kind of hiccups and bumps and challenges along the way. And it's just a really incredible honor and privilege to help kind of support the next generation as they become independent adults of tomorrow, for sure.
So why would you say counseling is important?
Counseling is important because I think a lot of times we perhaps live in a society that's very individualistic, right? So it focuses on, oh, you can do anything yourself, and we're very self-sufficient, and we're able to do kind of everything and anything that we set our minds to. And while I think that's a wonderful idea and thought, inevitably we are social creatures. We need each other. We need relationships and connections with others. And sometimes we encounter things that are just too big for us to carry alone, right? And sometimes we just need someone to kind of hold our hand through it, right? And so being that person, having families and students allow me into some of their most vulnerable times is just a huge honor. And it's just so incredibly important, because we need each other, and we need to know that asking for help is a sign of strength. That's an incredibly brave thing to do, and we don't have to face everything on our own and by ourselves. There are people out there that care, and there are people out there that can help us through some really challenging times, even if we may not see how that's going to happen.
So you worked a lot with families and children.
Mhm.
How would you define childhood emotional abuse?
So it's a very oftentimes difficult thing to define, but it is, physical abuse obviously is very easy to define. It's bruises and physical injury and things along those lines. But emotional abuse is not visible, and but that um, does not mean that those scars and that impact is any less profound. In fact, I sometimes believe it can be more profound because it's not visible, and because a lot of times people do feel like they have to cope with it on their own because it isn't visible and people don't know to ask, right? So it is something that is oftentimes chronic. It happens over a period of time, often months and years. It can come from a variety of sources. It can come from parents, it can come from other significant adults, it can come from friends and peers, as well as with technology and social media, it can come from people we don't know. And so, but it's something that we internalize. It's meaning we kind of file it away and we keep it with us, and we carry it with us, and it shapes not only how we view ourselves when we're young and vulnerable, and are still trying to figure out what that means, and it impacts how we connect to others, right? So it impacts our ability to trust in other people. It impacts our ability to form connections and form relationships. And so, from that perspective, I think it's a vitally important thing to talk about and to be aware of, and what those signs may look like, or just simply taking the time to ask somebody truly how they are and how things are going, and checking in with people, knowing oftentimes that if somebody is hurting, it's not always visible to the naked eye.
So, how can we tell the difference between childhood emotional abuse and the average experience of being a kid?
So I think the difference is going to be um, the chronicity of it. So oftentimes someone says, they're as a kid, kids say things that aren't always the nicest things. But it oftentimes tends to be a one off situation, or it tends to be passing, and it tends to not be something the that characterizes a relationship, right? Between two people, whether it be two friends or a parent and a child. So I think that that's definitely something that would be different about childhood emotional abuse, would be that it would characterize a relationship. It would be happening again and again. It would be something that truly did impact the person, and how they viewed themselves and how they connected with others. Those sort of passing childhood situations where you might have someone say an unpleasant thing, it may be a temporary thing where people's feelings are hurt, but there's always kind of amends made, and oftentimes, um, people are able to kind of move past it, learn from it, and not repeat the same mistake. But when you find an abusive situation, it tends to be, as I said, chronic. It tends to be something that characterizes that relationship, and it tends to be something that really profoundly impacts the recipient, and changes fundamentally kind of how they see themselves and how they interact with others.
As someone who works in a school environment, how do you see childhood emotional abuse affecting a child's school experience?
So a lot of times it can play out in a variety of different ways. So sometimes students demonstrate lack of confidence, especially in new environments or with new tasks or novel situations. They oftentimes almost always assume that they can't do it, or that they're not good enough, or and so there's this kind of, you start to see this sort of negative self-image, negative self-talk, this ability, this perception that the person just doesn't possess the abilities or the intelligence or whatever skills that they feel like they would need to succeed at the task. So they sometimes are hesitant to try, hesitant to contribute, just because that they're just not sure or certain of that they have the abilities or the intelligence to navigate such a situation successfully. A lot of times I see it in friendships and relationships. The child will be hesitant to trust others, trust other adults, trust other peers, feeling like the only person that they can trust is themselves. And so oftentimes there's interruptions in social development and peer interactions and relationships. Oftentimes there's hesitancy when it comes to kind of parental communication. I do a lot of, with students, I do a lot of communicating with parents, and find myself oftentimes saying to students, this is something I really think I should share with mom and dad. There oftentimes is a hesitancy or a difficulty in that parental relationship. And that oftentimes can cause a lot of anxiety or a lot of stress for the student. So it's oftentimes a whole host of different things that you may see, but those are some of the areas that I see most frequently, I would say.
In talking with parents, have you ever had to speak with the child's parent regarding their treatment of their child?
It's not been something yet that's been kind of the main topic when I interact with parents, but as a rule of thumb, I tend to always give examples of ways to phrase things or questions that might be asked, just as, kind of tips when it comes to challenging conversations, or if there are parental concerns about the student, how might we find more information if we feel like our student isn't talking with us. Oftentimes, as I said, that's developmentally expected. So just kind of how do we foster that communication strategies? So I'm fortunate that, at this point, it hasn't been a main focus of a conversation that I've had with a parent, but I definitely, just as a rule of thumb, kind of, we talk about how we might ask questions, or how we might phrase things, or what might be good terms or terminology to use, just, in interacting with students around kind of complex and sensitive topics.
If a child cannot get counseling, what are some specific things they can do on their own in terms of setting healthy boundaries and protecting their mental health and self-esteem on their own?
So, I think if they do find difficulty identifying formal counseling or formal supports, I would highly recommend identifying an adult that the student can trust. And it could be anyone from like an adult family member, perhaps outside the family of origin, to a teacher, to a coach, just somebody that student can have a positive relationship with. and be a support to that student. I also definitely think, as you mentioned, kind of boundary setting, self-care strategies. Those are things that I talk a great deal about, cultivating resilience. And those can go a long way. Healthy sleep habits, nutrition habits, healthy, knowing what healthy relationships look like and healthy communication looks like. So I oftentimes talk a lot about that in sessions with students, so that they can kind of have a nice, point of comparison, like, oh, okay, this is what's, a good conversation might look like. This is what perhaps a not so healthy conversation might look like. But yeah, just really focusing on resilience building, and then really working with the family, to identify, supports, formal supports, perhaps outside of the school environment, in the long term. Because over time, oftentimes these situations really do need a really solid relationship that takes a little while to form. But encouraging students to identify healthy, relationships that they have with adults already in their lives, and feeling that they can trust that person, and having that as an outlet. But yes, all sorts of talking about healthy boundaries and coping strategies for sure.
And finally, what would you say are the most important steps to developing a healthy sense of self?
Oh my goodness. I think that is something that's a lifelong process. And so I think that as children and as adolescents and even as adults, just being aware that it's not necessarily a destination, but a journey, if you will. So when it comes to sense of self, and when it comes to, what we need and from our environment and from others, that changes, based on a whole host of different things. And so realizing that we need to adapt a little bit, and focus, really be keyed into what our needs are, and where does our energy need to go, right? So oftentimes focusing on what it is that we can control. We spend a lot of time, you know, focusing on things that perhaps we can't always control. So just really focusing in on what's within our control, and that sense of self is going to be ever changing, ever adapting, and we have to change and adapt with it. And so, using these coping strategies and resilience building over the long term, over the lifespan, right? Because inevitably, as part of life, there are going to be stumbling blocks. There are going to be things, challenges that we experience and hardships that we experience. And so, we kind of have to, not only perhaps plan for and expect, but how do we come back from that? How do we kind of pick ourselves back up and say, okay, what's the next step from here? So just really focusing on that it is a long-term goal, and that those things that we might need may change, and our sense of self will change along with it, and being prepared for, helping to prepare students and things like that for those changes and those things along the way.
Thank you so much for your insight, Dr. Shapiro. I think it's really valuable.
Absolutely. Absolutely.